Bristol. Why, the very name seems to have the taste of adventure and the sharp, bitter tang of ocean spray about it. And with very good reason. For this historic harbour on the western edge of Europe has 1,000 swashbuckling tales to tell. Tales of bloodthirsty pirates who roamed the seven seas. Tales of explorers who ventured into uncharted waters. Tales of kidnapping, press gangs who haunted the taverns in the old city centre, on the lookout for likely lads they could kidnap and force aboard their ships. Bristol's merchants grew rich on the commerce, for which the city became famous. But they brought shame too, with the evils of transatlantic slavery. Bristol is the city of some grand characters we're only too happy to remember. Men like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the great engineer, and the navigator, John Cabot, who sailed from here to find a new world on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, 500 years ago.
And it's the city of some we'd rather forget, like Blackbeard the pirate, the notorious mass murderer who lived up there. I don't suppose there's another city in the world where sea dogs and salt spray played such dramatic parts. And if you think that all ship shape and Bristol fashion is a compliment, then you've got another thing coming.
More of that later. Matthew's Yard became a landmark as Bristol prepared itself for the International Festival of the Sea. The festival helps mark the 500th anniversary of John Cabot's historic voyage of 1497. He sailed with the city's blessings to launch a new age. But this marsh between hills is where the story really begins. The place where the rivers Frome and Avon met offered much. It lay 7 miles from the open sea. Its great cliffs and mud banks gave protection, and the Avon's huge tides completed its defences. Ancient man knew this route well. It lay between Wales and the sacred places of Salisbury Plain. From this inlet in West Wales came huge blue stones which held a special mystery. The Blue Lagoon, as it's known, was flooded earlier in the century, drowning the ancient quarry. Great boulders were carefully mined from the sides of the quarry and then strapped on sea-going rafts for their long journey to the land across the Severn. The voyage took the huge stones from the Preselles, along the Bristol Channel and then up the Avon Gorge on their sacred journey to the heart of the massive Sun Temple of Stonehenge. Invading Romans chose the Avon as the safest harbour on the largely cliff-lined southwest peninsula. Their harbour exists today. We know it as Sea Mills. The Romans called it Abona and built a road from their port to the popular spa of Aquasulus, or Bath. But it was another invasion which really put Bristol on the map. Once the Normans had conquered Britain, they surveyed their new territory for strongholds and found one at the settlement of Brigstow, the place of the bridge, then fortified it with a mighty castle. The Normans brought wealth and success, and trade flourished. There soon wasn't room for all the ships which wanted to use Bristol, so in 1239 a huge trench was dug through today's city centre, with picks and shovels and back-breaking labour. Ships from Spain, France, Portugal and Ireland used the new quaysides, while the local craft docked at Welshback. The city merchants thrived and amassed huge fortunes which they lavished on a grand lifestyle in their fine houses. They changed the skyline with churches to advertise their wealth. And none was more glorious than the merchants and sailors' favourite, St Mary Redcliffe. It was the finest, richest Gothic church in the land. The city merchants thrived and amassed huge fortunes which they lavished on a grand lifestyle in their fine houses. They changed the skyline with churches to advertise their wealth. And none was more glorious than the merchants and sailors' favourite, St Mary Redcliffe. It was the finest, richest Gothic church in the land, and it attracted pilgrims and patrons from throughout Europe. Merchants vied with each other to embellish this shrine. Men like William Canning, with his 9 ships and a payroll of 800 seamen.
William Canning loved this church, and he spent a huge amount of his fortune on it. Bristol Sea Dogs also loved St Mary Redcliffe, but for an entirely different reason. They would walk through this porch at the end of every voyage, and they would fall upon their knees and thank God for their safe return. And then they would pray that their next voyage would also be a safe one.
Bristol's growing wealth was flaunted in these monumental buildings. But another, more thrilling chapter was opening. Ships were becoming swifter, voyages longer, the world was becoming a smaller place. Men talked of Spice Islands across the ocean, but it was another prize that our seamen craved.
Fish fingers. Good old-fashioned medieval-style fish fingers. That's what got Bristol's Jack Towers going for the race to the west. And more than likely, they beat the great navigators like Columbus by years. And what makes the best fish fingers? You're right. Cod. In those days, the best way of preserving fish was by drying and salting as soon as the fish were caught. The problem was, Iceland had the best cod fishing grounds, run by the Hanseatic League. Now, the Hanseatic League were not in the business of lining the pockets of Bristol's sea dogs. So, why not sail a little further west and find Bristol's own cod fishing grounds, preferably with a shoreline where the fish could be dried and salted. So why do we know so little about Bristol's fishing secret? Because it was in everybody's interest to keep quiet about Bristol's new trade. Otherwise, they'd all want to jump on the bandwagon.
The secret journey took them into uncharted waters. A dozen years before Columbus bumped into the Bahamas, 2 small ships sailed from Bristol. They deliberately skirted Iceland and went further and further west. And here is what they discovered. A new, unexplored land on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean. They found a shoreline which offered landing places, and above all, they found shoals of cod almost beyond belief. The only creatures they had to share this prize with were the seals and seabirds. They did their best to keep their fishy secret after they sailed back, but tongues wagged and news of their voyage spread, and the race to the west was on. Columbus knew of the Bristol voyage, but he chose a more southerly route, to the Caribbean. Columbus is credited with discovering the New World, but it was another Italian, John Cabot, who with his ship the Matthew landed on the American continent in 1497.
Of course, Cabot didn't discover America. Native Americans had already colonized the continent tens of thousands of years before, and Norse explorers had already landed on the mainland, and possibly a few Irish monks too. But Cabot and his Bristol crew were the first modern Europeans to prove that there was something very big out there. And of course, the Bristol merchants were determined to exploit it.
On his return, Cabot presented this curiosity to St Mary Redcliffe. It's the rib of a whale collected on that distant shore. And perhaps he gave America its name. His backers included a leading Bristol merchant called Richard Americ. Suddenly, everything had changed. The whole of Europe was looking to the west. Until Cabot, Bristol had been at the far west of the known world. But now its buccaneering sailors had found themselves perfectly placed to exploit the potential of exciting new horizons.
Admiral Sir William Penn, who's buried here at St Mary Redcliffe, and his army is still on show, captured Jamaica for Britain to start a thriving trade with the Caribbean.
As a thank you for his services, Penn was granted tens of thousands of acres of land in America. His Quaker son, William, used his part of the inheritance to found an idealistic community of Quakers who sailed with him from Bristol. The pioneering visionary established a thriving settlement which set the pace for others to follow.
And he called it Pennsylvania.
Bristol was now one of the world's leading ports, famous for its trade and its shipyards, and infamous for the daring and cruelty of the worst of its sea dogs, the pirates. The boldest were seamen who had risen through the ranks of the Royal Navy, only to be denied a chance to captain their own ships. They became pirate captains, like Bartholomew Roberts, who roamed the Atlantic in his Bristol flagship, the Royal Fortune. In less than 4 years, he's said to have captured 400 ships. They were hard-living rogues who feared no one, and they rarely showed mercy. One report speaks of Robert's crew ransacking a ship like a parcel of furies, and once the hold was pillaged, the ship was often scuppered. Madagascar was the first great pirate headquarters, but the Caribbean soon took over, and the Bahamas boasted more than 2,000 lawless buccaneers. The hulks of 40 ships were left beached at the pirate stronghold as a warning of what could happen to an unfortunate vessel overhauled by Roberts on the Spanish Main. But despite the very real evil, there's a strange romance about these misfits. The treasures they captured were certainly romantic. Pieces of 8, jewels, tobacco and rum. And there was no lack of recruits to sail with the boldest captains. The greatest prizes were Spanish and Portuguese galleons, laden with gold pillaged from ancient South American civilizations. Pirate crews were well organized, ruthless and efficient. And they worked to a violent set of rules. Any man found stealing booty for himself was shot or marooned. Bristol was perfectly poised to exploit its superb geographical position, its harbour and the skill of its seamen. It was not only the second city of England, but also the country's undisputed second port. In its long history of shipbuilding, yards like these at Wapping had produced generations of magnificent craft. Its merchantmen sailed to every corner of the globe. And its shipyards were famous for magnificent frigates which fought for the Royal Navy in battles against the American colonists and France. This was Bristol's golden age. It was reflected on the busy quaysides. There was plenty of work for everyone in modernizing the city and its harbour, and there were always ships on the lookout for crews. The Avon Gorge had become one of the world's most famous harbour entrances, and the long haul upriver to the docks was familiar to generations of sailors. Neptune himself seemed to be smiling on Bristol and promising safe passages to and from the ancient port. Bristol's seagoing pride was commemorated, and its taverns and the streets were always crowded. For older men, there was the promise of retirement, to the shelter of an almshouse after a lifetime at sea. Freed from all the storms, the tempest, and the rage of billows, here we spend our age. It was no less than they deserved, for all their efforts in making this one of the busiest, most profitable ports in the world. For younger sailors on shore leave, the taverns were the great attraction, and you'd hear a dozen or more different languages in any of these pubs on a busy night. One particular inn offered a very useful extra feature. It is this spy hole for lookouts to keep a watchful eye for press gangs. Some believe it's the model for Spyglass Inn, where the young Jim Hawkins met Long John Silver before they sailed together for Treasure Island. The alehouses saw many wild nights as returning crews blew their wages after months at sea. As for the merchants who profited from their voyages, most chose to live as near to the dockside as possible. Their smart Redcliffe homes overlooked the harbour. They could check that ships left promptly when tide and winds were fair, and they'd be the first aboard a returning ship, inspecting the cargo and calculating the profits. St Mary Redcliffe was still the seaman's favourite church, and returning sailors still made their traditional Thanksgiving visits. Newly arrived goods were ferried from the docks to nearby warehouses. Redcliffe bred generations of sea dogs since the earliest days, and it is reputed to have bred the bloodiest chief of all in the dying days of piracy, Edward Teach, and this was his flag of terror. We still remember his other name, Blackbeard the pirate. He was a huge man with a thick beard, long, wild hair, and the face of a devil. Blackbeard found no lack of volunteers for his growing fleet, as he plundered and pillaged his way along the coasts of America and the Caribbean. His crew were described as reprobates who encouraged and spirited one another in wickedness, and at the height of his reign of terror, Blackbeard had 4 ships and 400 men. Captives could face any number of horrors at the hands of these ruffians, and Blackbeard's chiefs whipped up a frenzy of hate against them. Death, when it came, was probably a merciful release for victims forced off ships. No one knows how many died at the hands of Blackbeard and his comrades, but all feared his terror tactics. He'd stick smouldering fuses into his matted hair, creating a terrifying impression as his mad eyes stared out of a mass of hair and choking sulphurous smoke. Blackbeard roamed the seas of the West Atlantic for several years and grew bolder all the time. He even landed on the American mainland and attacked settlements. In 1718, he and the pirates' chief Charles Vane held a huge party in North Carolina. It was the largest gathering of pirates seen in America, with wine, women, and song for all. But by now, the authorities had had enough of these villains of the high seas, and captured pirates could expect no mercy. In November 1718, Blackbeard blockaded Charleston, Carolina, and pillaged its shipping. He'd gone too far. The Navy hit back. Blackbeard and his pirate horde were hunted down to their hiding place in the shallow waters off the coast of Carolina and attacked. Blackbeard roared his defiance at the Navy's men, but the game was up. His severed head was hung from the bowsprit of his boat. Some Bristol seamen had turned to piracy, but others were targets of the cowardly crime of wrecking. The Bristol Channel is a dangerous place, even today. Modern navigation has reduced the risks and brought far greater safety. But despite the latest technology, accidents still happen. This coastline has been a ship's and a sailor's graveyard for centuries. Its lethal mix of big tides, treacherous currents, and rapidly changing weather can defeat the finest seaman. Just when a ship was within hours of the safety of Avon, it could find itself lashed by the worst weather of all. Once, of course, in these perilous waters, disaster looms, and another fine ship finds itself dashed against the unforgiving rocks. Shipwreck on this dreadful shore wasn't the only terror for crews, as the hull smashed on the rocks. Another dreadful enemy might be lying in wait for them, once they summoned the courage to leap down to the wave-battered beach below. It was the menace of the wreckers of the Bristol Channel. Pillaging wrecked ships sailing in and out of Bristol was a lucrative, murderous trade on both sides of the channel. There was even a legend that to save victims from the shipwrecks was to risk the wrath of the sea itself. A beached ship offered instant riches to poor villagers. Holds could reveal magnificent booty. Tobacco, sugar, wine, or rum, it meant a fortune, and it was in no one's interest to blab about the ransacking and murder that had taken place. It was an evil business, and cost some Bristol seamen their lives, but it bore no comparison to a much murkier evil: Bristol's deep involvement with slaving. Bristol looked prosperous on the surface. The vast slaving profits had seen to that. However, cannier observers noticed that things weren't quite so busy on the Avon. There was a fair bit of trade with America, the Caribbean, and Europe, wine, tobacco, and sugar to keep the harbour ticking over. But newer ports like Liverpool were catching up fast, and without that ride up the Avon and the notorious Horseshoe Bend. All shipshape and Bristol fashion, perhaps the phrase was first coined as a compliment, but it had come to mean something very different than smartly scrubbed decks and well-turned-out rigging. More modern shipbuilding yards in other ports offered strong competition, and rival harbours were charging less for the very latest services. The merchants had to act to halt the sharp decline. Shipshape and Bristol fashion meant boats had to be doubly strong to trade here. Otherwise they would break under the pressure of twice-daily tidal seesaws on the mudbanks. Bristol was falling behind, and it showed. At last, something was done. Locks were installed at hot wells, and the harbour became non-tidal. But it had come too little and too late. They tried spicing up Bristol's flagging reputation with a spectacular entrance. For years there had been calls for a bridge across the Avon to link the growing suburb of Clifton with the Somerset side. A competition to bridge the gap was announced. It caused a sensation, and attracted a weird and wonderful collection of designs. The competing engineers came up with a romantic Gothic arch, a functional iron span, a classical monument, a vast stone wedge, elegant latticework, an airy suspension bridge, a medieval fantasy. The winner was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was recovering in Clifton after an accident while building his father's tunnel under the Thames. Brunel's winning design was an Egyptian beauty. A ceremonial start was made on its construction, but it proved to be no more than a gesture. Bristol had entered a twilight zone. It turned into a nightmare on October the 29th, 1831. What began as a demonstration for reform exploded into one of the worst riots in British history. The spark was a protest against an unpopular local politician. Mayhem followed, and the cathedral was only just saved. The mob in Queen's Square gave vent to their rage against Bristol's discredited leaders. They looted cellars and burned the homes of merchants they blamed for Bristol's decline. Some of the angriest were the sailors and the dockers who had been abandoned and left destitute. It took a murderous charge by sabre-wielding dragoons to finally end the riots here in Queen's Square. Bristol had suffered an appalling body blow. The Bishop of Bristol's palace was a smoking ruin, and its contents had either been stolen or destroyed. Queen's Square, one of the finest in Europe, had been wrecked. Had the city of Cabot and Canning really come to this? The authorities weren't slow to take revenge on the Bristolians, who had so sensationally humiliated them. 82 rioters were convicted, 43 were imprisoned, and 34 were transported. The other 5 were publicly hanged here, above the charred gate of the jail, which had been ruined when rioters freed the prisoners inside. Most of the new middle class stood aside during the riots. They too loathed the merchants. Whatever Brunel felt, he was still one of those who waded in to rescue furniture from the blazing mansion house in Queen's Square. Despite everything, Brunel saw a brilliant future for Bristol as a gateway to the United States. In 1837 he launched the Great Western in Bristol, and in 1843 came the world's first truly modern ocean liner, the SS Great Britain. He modernized the docks and its machinery. He dreamt of when the transatlantic passengers would travel down to Bristol on his broad-gauge Great Western Railway. They would arrive at Temple Mead Station in Bristol and go on to spend a pleasant night or two at his Royal Western Hotel behind College Green, and then a safe, swift journey across the Atlantic on a modern steamship with all the latest facilities. It didn't happen. This was the reality of sailing in and out of Bristol. The Avon's mudbanks were still a constant threat, and his beloved Clifton's suspension bridge stood unfinished and derelict. It must have broken his heart to see these naked bridge piers year after year. Brunel gave up on Bristol. The city's problems had sapped even his spirits. But Bristol hadn't quite given up on Brunel. The year after he died, work on the bridge was resumed as a memorial to what he'd done for Bristol. Chains from his Hungerford Bridge were used to span the dizzy gap. The bridge opened at last on the 8th of December, 1864. Not to his beautiful original design, it's true, but it is still one of the wonders of Europe. Brunel's was the last big effort to revive the harbour's flagging fortunes. There were ships on the city docks, to be sure, but industry was taking over. Exotic warehouses on the medieval quaysides were becoming relics of another age, and when a new port was built downriver at Avonmouth, it creamed off even more of the trade. The dying harbour was given a couple of reprieves during the 2 world wars, when trade was almost as brisk as the good old days. During the first, it was a busy supply centre for the army.
During the Second World War, the city docks had considerable strategic value, and there were several raids to destroy the old harbour. But St Mary Redcliffe remained unscathed. But what about this extraordinary relic of the war? It's a lethal lump of tram line embedded here in the churchyard like some latter-day Excalibur. It was hurled in the air when a high-explosive bomb landed on Redcliffe Hill, and it's been here ever since.
But there was no peace dividend for the harbour, and by the 1970s, the cranes were idle. Why not convert the derelict docks into an attraction? And that's what Bristol did. Brunel's beloved SS Great Britain came limping home and was transformed from a wreck into a proud reminder of a glorious maritime past. Before long, there was as many masts as ever, but of a different sort. Today, the old harbour is a popular leisure attraction and a waterside playground. The old square riggers and their epic voyages have given way to smaller craft, built for fun, and not the hard graft of a sea dog's life on the ocean wave.